Previously on The Revolution, the fight for independence didn't end with Yorktown.
The same men who fought in the Revolution are now fighting against their own government. There are more American deaths at the end of the war than at the beginning. The war is not necessarily over.
The Constitutional Convention was do or die for an anything but United States of America.
There are all kinds of questions about what's going to be the direction for this new nation. And you can't have 13 different answers, you need to have one answer.
The new United States is really a very fragile country.
The economy was in shambles. There was no currency at the end of the war. It had lost all its value.
A lot of folks fear a new federal government just as they fear the crown.
Mount Vernon, Virginia, April 16, 1789. George Washington, gentleman farmer and former commander of America's Revolutionary Forces, is packing to leave his beloved home once again. For 8 years, Washington led the American army through a grueling war and no one believed he could win. Against the most powerful empire in the world, Great Britain. His army lost more battles than it won. But by sheer will and perseverance, they marched their way to ultimate victory. Now, at 57, nothing would make George Washington happier than to live out his days in the serenity of Mount Vernon.
Washington has very much subordinated himself to the needs of the nation. He has made untold sacrifices. He really does intend to retire quietly to civilian life.
But Washington's long revolutionary road has not yet reached an end. For the former commander-in-chief of the Army has again been summoned into service by Congress and the country. He is off on a trip to New York City to be sworn in as the first president of the United States of a new America.
Mob movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. So unwilling am I, in the evening of a life nearly consumed in public cares, to quit a peaceful abode for an ocean of difficulties. George Washington.
Everybody tells George Washington it isn't that they think he should be the president. He must be the president.
His 8-day ride will take him across many of the former colonies of America, through the bloody battlefields where thousands lost their lives under his command. Lives given in the name of liberty. It is a journey that will have the future president not only looking ahead, but looking back as well at what made George Washington the greatest American general. The year is 1775, 14 years earlier. The place, Continental Congress. George Washington is about to take center stage. 10 years of riots and rebellion have set the 13 American colonies ablaze. The Stamp Act riots, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. These have brought the British Army to American soil. Lexington, Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill have pitted citizen soldiers against the most powerful empire in the world. Now the colonists need an army and someone to lead it. June 15, 1775. John Adams, Massachusetts delegate and well-known revolutionary thinker, lays out a proposal: the creation of a professional army. And Adams calls for the immediate appointment of a commander to head up this new force. The choice is unanimous. A gentleman planter from Virginia, a hero in the French and Indian War of the 1750s, and the only delegate to show up every day in his military uniform, 43-year-old George Washington.
Oh, here's a very impressive guy. I mean, he wears his military uniform with great dignity. And of course, he shows up making the point. I have military experience. I am a person who you can count on as your military commander.
He has the image to do it. He's got the experience. He's from Virginia. They make him the commander-in-chief, and he modestly says, I'm really not equal to the task, and I'll just do my best.
Later, there will be times when Congress will wonder if his best is good enough. But there were few men in 1775 with the experience and, most importantly, the character to take on the job of Commander-in-Chief. July 1775. 2 weeks after his appointment, Washington arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take charge of his soldiers, and is stunned by the condition of his so-called army.
These men are ragged, disheveled, getting drunk on duty, no knowledge of how to handle a musket efficiently. There was no discipline, there was certainly no hygiene, very little structure. It was a mess.
These are Washington's revolutionaries. These are the soldiers given him to defend against the British Army. He has precious little time to turn this woefully undisciplined, underprepared, undersupplied army into a force that can stand up against the strongest empire in the world. Today, the summer of 1775, now 14 years ago, is a distant memory. It was hardly the way Washington had expected to lead an upstart group of rebels to glory against a mighty superpower. But Washington was never the kind of leader who would let any challenge stand in his way.
He was very aware, I think, that he had a role to play in history and wanted to create a legacy that he could be proud of and America could be proud of.
Making the country proud began with a winter assault and, more importantly, the advice of others. Winter 1776. It has been 6 months since Washington has taken charge of the Continental forces. His army is a ragtag lot of citizen insurgents. But ever since the Battle of Concord, the untrained force has managed to hem the British into the city of Boston. Now, the question is, how to get them out? Washington is eager to bring the fight to the British, to launch his first offensive of the war. His plan? To send waves of foot soldiers into a full frontal attack on the city of Boston. Yet his young officers, like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, stand in staunch opposition.
George Washington always had the ability to listen to many people. He thinks everybody's view is important, and if he can listen to enough opinions, he'll know as much as they do. A hallmark of good leadership.
Instead, Washington's officers suggest using an untapped resource. 120,000 pounds of artillery captured by the Americans from a remote New York outpost, Fort Ticonderoga. They propose hauling the cannon under the cover of night to Dorchester Heights and training this newly acquired firepower on the enemy below. Washington considers the idea and knows it is the right choice. He orders the plan into action. On the morning of March 5th, 1776, British General Howe awakes to the sight of 20 cannon pointing down on his ships in the harbor. With one stroke, the Americans checkmate the British.
It's not until after they see Ticonderoga's guns on Dorchester Heights that they realize they got to get the heck out of there.
And so they do. 8,900 British soldiers and 1,100 loyalists, the Americans siding with the British, take just 2 weeks to board their ships and leave the colonies. For now. Washington savors the first victory of his command. Boston, the beloved birthplace of the Revolution is back in Patriot hands, thanks in no small part to the good sense and creativity of his young officers. But peering over his shoulder, just waiting for him to stumble, are a number of his more senior officers. Over time, Generals Charles Lee, Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold will each connive to undermine Washington's command. The winter of 1776 was just the beginning, and that easy victory at Boston was but a fleeting illusion. For 7 more years of war still lay ahead, a war that taxed every fiber of his character to survive, let alone to become president. April 17, 1789. A world-weary but resolute George Washington enters the second day of his journey to New York City, where he will soon be sworn in as the first president of the United States of America. Washington now heads to Baltimore, Maryland, where the great hero of the Revolution is greeted by 10,000 citizens at cannon salutes of the new nation he is destined to lead.
There are a few people who are legends in their own time, and Washington was deservedly one of them.
I am so much affected by this fresh proof of my country's esteem and confidence that silence can best explain my gratitude. George Washington.
The road before him is daunting. It will wind through political territory never before explored by any man in history. But Washington and America have grown accustomed to blazing new trails, a course that was set some 13 years earlier. New Year's Day, 1776. The first day of a momentous year for a nation in the throes of birth. This is the day Washington receives news. Britain's King George III has issued a proclamation. Crush the rebellion by any means necessary. They are words that only serve to steel the resolve of the general and his men, and are the first in a year marked by words. For now a voice rises in the colonies that galvanizes the cause. Words from another Englishman. Words that will help lead the colonies out of rebellion and into revolution.
We have it within our power to begin the world over again. 'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Now is the seed time of continental union.
The writer, Thomas Paine. The words, what Americans long to hear. It is a 46-page pamphlet titled simply Common Sense, and it spreads like wildfire throughout the colonies.
Some say 100,000 copies of this were published. Translate that into population rates today, that would be like selling 20 million books through Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Paine's Common Sense releases the genie from the bottle. Words mixed with an idea to break totally with the king, to be independent.
Suddenly, in every tavern, in every meeting house, everywhere people congregate, they're talking seriously about this idea. Should we go for independence or not?
It is a potent tonic for a people in revolt. In the ranks of Washington's army, the transforming effect of the words is immediate.
It touched everyone of that era. Everyone knew they had a stake in it, and it was perhaps the most glorious moment in the history of this country where people really did believe the birthday of a new world is at hand.
It has been years since Washington has seen Thomas Paine. The author of Common Sense has left America behind, off to sow the seeds of a new revolution in another country. where the word liberty is on everyone's tongue. France, the monarchy that backed the Americans in the War of Independence, is trembling from the same democratic forces she helped unleash in America. Peasants and common people are shaking the foundations of centuries of feudal rule. Paine may have departed this new nation, but it was his words that helped lay the groundwork for the world's seminal revolutionary document, America's Declaration of Independence. Spring 1776. George Washington is moving his men south from Boston toward the next big military battle. The British are coming back. Their target, New York City. 100 miles to the south, the Continental Congress has reconvened in Philadelphia for a fight of their own. The political battle for independence. Here, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Hancock, and luminaries from all 13 colonies prepare to declare in writing their intention to break from Britain. They turn to a young Virginia lawyer, a rising star in American politics, 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson, to craft the words that will spell treason against the king. It is a heady and vexing task to articulate the cause for which people are willing to die, the cause of liberty. But defining liberty, that is the rub.
Who's in and who's out? Who's included? Does this mean everybody? Does this mean only the rich? Does this mean property holders? How far do we go? Who's included in this new nation?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
But does that really mean all men? There is the matter of slavery. Jefferson owned slaves. Washington owned slaves. And these are the men leading the fight for human liberty.
Slavery was in clear counterpoint to the ideals of the Revolution. These guys weren't idiots. They understood the notion of paradox, but they also believed very strongly, particularly in the plantation economies, that slavery was the basis of their livelihood.
July 1st, 1776. Jefferson delivers his final draft of the Declaration to Congress and watches in horror as the delegates tear it apart.
And that was 3 days of debate in Congress, in which Congress took out 89 different things, including any language criticizing the practice of slavery. And Jefferson just sat there writhing through the whole thing.
With the issue of slavery now tabled for another day, the final draft is approved. America has a birthday, July 4th. Copies are taken by horseback everywhere throughout the colonies.
In the town squares all over the country, church bells were ringing and the people were huzzahing, the crowd was applauding. People really did believe the birthday of a new world is at hand.
It's happened so many other times since the American Revolution that it's easy to overlook its novelty. A nation declaring itself independent, really without precedent.
It is a decisive moment for every American, and an especially grave one for the commander of the Continental Army. There is no turning back, and now the British, with the largest force ever sent across the ocean, are descending upon New York City. For Washington, that memorable year, 1776, is one he would rather forget. Because of the Declaration of Independence, history has recorded it as epic and glorious. But for Washington, it stands out as perhaps the most grueling and humiliating of his life. April 18th, 1789, 5 a.m. Few men in America have slept in as many different places as George Washington. This morning, he makes final preparations to leave Baltimore, beginning the third day of his northward trip to New York City. There, in just a matter of days, he will be inaugurated as the first president of the United States. It will be a triumphant moment for a man whose confidence and reputation once lay in tatters, just weeks after the exuberance that followed the Declaration of Independence.
We tend to look back from today and see Washington always having been that legend, but in fact, if you stopped the clock in 1776, you would have suspected that this guy would be out of a job pretty soon.
Summer 1776. The nation has been set afire with the idea of liberty. But at his headquarters in New York City, General George Washington is faced with the reality of what stands between the colonies and their independence. The British have returned spectacularly. 130 warships and nearly 25,000 men sail into New York Harbor.
When the British come in the summer of 1776, it's like Star Wars. It's the Empire Strikes Back.
This is the most powerful military nation on earth that is bringing that power to bear on you.
It is a sight to unnerve even the most battle-hardened soldier. The British sailed past Manhattan and set up camp on Staten Island.
Washington was faced with a tremendous task. He had no navy to speak of, and he was trying to protect a group of islands with hundreds of miles of shoreline against the world's most powerful naval force.
Washington's men spend the summer digging in on Long Island's Brooklyn Heights, where they expect the British to launch their attack. Liberty must equal war. Late August 1776. In the early morning, the British commander, General William Howe, makes his move. More than 20,000 British soldiers march toward the American positions. It is their first head-on attack against Washington's army. The battle is a bloodbath. The Continental Army is totally overwhelmed. On this day, 300 Americans die, and another 1,000 are captured before beating a swift and chaotic retreat. Washington watches in shock as the best-trained army in the world easily outmaneuvers his. In one stroke, the British have nearly destroyed the American army and put a quick end to the so-called War of Independence. Washington is forced to make a desperate move before all is lost. Under cover of night, he orders an all-out retreat back to Manhattan. Washington may not have a navy, but he has resourceful, courageous fishermen from Massachusetts. All through the night, they use any boat they can get their hands on to ferry 9,000 men to the safety of Manhattan. At dawn, the Americans receive one providential break. A strange and eerie fog sets in over New York Harbor. The British see and hear nothing as the last of the soldiers escape. When the fog lifts, the British find only a deserted enemy camp. The Continental Army has vanished.
The failure to capture them and to put a stop to the war
by rounding up the rebel forces really was one of the greatest blunders of the war. The British lost their best opportunity to win the war at a stroke.
Washington's army is now an army on the run, and the British waste no time in launching a new offensive. In battle after battle, the Continental Army is overwhelmed by the superior power and sheer number of British forces. They are driven off the Isle of Manhattan.
This really negatively affects the morale of his force, and perhaps more importantly, affects the morale of some of his subordinate commanders, who really now question whether or not Washington is the right man for this job.
Washington leads the remains of his defeated army on a retreat, south into New Jersey. A little more than a year into his command, the general is now pursued by the British and under siege from his own officers. One of them, Charles Lee, Washington's most experienced general, sees a perfect opportunity to supplant his commander-in-chief, and he isn't shy about saying so to anyone who might help him get ahead.
A certain great man is most damnably deficient. I foresaw all that has happened. Had I the powers, I could do much good. General Charles Lee.
One of Lee's confidants, an increasingly disillusioned officer named Joseph Reed, encourages Lee to make a move against the commander-in-chief. Washington is totally unaware of the designs of Lee and Reed. That is, until a courier delivers him the wrong letter.
My dear Reed, I lament with you that fatal indecision of mind, which in war is a much greater disqualification than stupidity, or even want of personal courage. Eternal defeat must attend the men of the best parts, if cursed with indecision. General Charles Lee.
Washington's response was to write to Reed and say, I opened this by accident, I thought it was official business, and to just try to smooth it over. I think all of these moments really just highlight the extraordinary equilibrium that he maintained.
Washington lets it pass, but he now knows that his power is weakening, and that both British and American wolves are at his heels.
As Washington flees across New Jersey, he fully realizes that this revolution might be over. He's a commander-in-chief of an army that has shrunk drastically. Congressmen write their wives and their friends letters saying that the game is just about up. They're fearful that this war is shortly going to be over.
Washington had never been lower than those dark days of 1776. Others thought him destined for oblivion rather than legend. But legends are made from character and vision. Just when all seemed lost, he summoned both with one bold stroke. April 19, 1789. Day 4 of George Washington's journey to New York City to become the first president of the United States. Leaving Maryland behind, he is heading toward Wilmington, Delaware. Washington crosses the fields and dells of America and passes the tributaries that lead to a river of great personal importance, the vital Delaware River, scene of one of Washington's greatest reversals of fortune, 13 years before. December 1776. In its Pennsylvania camp, the Continental Army finds itself back on its heels. Washington's poor judgment has cost the Americans New York City and depleted his fighting force. The British now occupy New Jersey and place Hessian forces at key junctions along the Delaware, places like Trenton. There, the King's men will catch their breath before the next season of fighting. In the American camp, faith in the revolution is falling as fast as the temperature, and many of his soldiers are ready to quit when their enlistments expire at year's end. Recently embedded with Washington's flagging army was the author of Common Sense, Thomas Paine, who bore witness to their travail. Again, he wields his pen to inspire a people with words, capturing the moment and the mood in a pamphlet. American Crisis.
Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and to repulse it. Time hath found us. Thomas Paine.
Washington takes these words to heart. It is time to act, to rescue the cause. With the end of the year fast approaching, Washington makes a bold decision to take his army across the Delaware River in a surprise attack at Trenton. Washington chooses Christmas Day to reveal his plan to his troops and readies them to reverse the course and take the fight to the British. The crossing is a monumental task. The same Massachusetts fishermen who had helped the army retreat from Brooklyn Heights in August must now put the army on the offensive. Ferrying 2,400 soldiers, horses, and artillery across the near-frozen river in blizzard conditions, and do it before dawn. Washington himself will lead his soldiers into battle.
Every school child in America is familiar with the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, when he's boldly in the front of the boat, standing up, looking heroically towards the eastern shore of the river. It would have been nice, but it didn't happen like that. Nobody stood up that night, wisely so.
In worsening weather, the crossing takes forever. Yet the plan remains: get to Trenton by dawn. But there is still a 9-mile march ahead of the Continentals. Light or no light, Washington has everything riding on this. The soldiers, some with only rags on their feet, must push on. When they arrive, the Hessians are caught off guard. The surprise attack is glorious.
The Battle of Trenton is a brutal encounter. The Americans surprise the Hessians, who tumble out of their barracks, grab their muskets, and attempt to defend themselves. The battle lasts less than an hour. The Hessians don't have a chance because they're surprised.
This is Washington's day. He sends a resounding message to the British and Americans alike. The Continental Army is back, and I am its undisputed leader.
Through most of the fall, there have been a number of officers who thought they could do his job better than he could, and a number of members of Congress who thought the same. That changes after Trenton.
Washington's triumph at Trenton was unmercifully short-lived. Back then, in 1777, he was still desperate for supplies and men to keep the war effort going. And most of all, Washington needed a navy against the British, who had total control of the port of New York City. Critical help would come from an old warhorse who never fired a shot or put on a uniform. To the rescue came the incomparable Benjamin Franklin. April 20th, 1789. The 5th day of George Washington's trip to New York City. His inauguration as the first president of the United States is just days away, and Washington expresses the optimism of a new nation to an old friend from France.
I really entertain greater hopes than I have at almost any former period that America will not finally disappoint the expectations of her friends. George Washington.
Washington and the United States owe a great debt to France and to the man who brought the European superpower to America's side 12 years earlier, Benjamin Franklin. It is winter 1777. Benjamin Franklin has just arrived in France on a secret mission. Franklin's writings and scientific discoveries have made him the most famous American in the world. Now his assignment is to use all his diplomatic skills to bring France's navy and treasury to America's side.
It seems like a fool's errand when you think about it. Franklin is sent to an absolute monarchy to ask them to fund a revolution against a king.
If anyone can bring the French on board, it is the wise and canny Franklin. But he needs Washington to appear as if he can win this war. Yet across the ocean in America, nothing could be farther from the truth. August 22nd, 1777, Hartsville, Pennsylvania. American scouts bring alarming news to Washington. The British fleet have entered the Chesapeake Bay and plan to launch an attack on Philadelphia, the capital of the newly confederated United States. Washington quickly moves his army south through Philadelphia to meet the British head-on. 3 weeks later, Washington positions his forces along the banks of a tributary to the Delaware River called Brandywine Creek. It is here that he will make his stand against the advancing British. September 11th, 1777, the Battle of Brandywine. Musket and artillery fire erupt between the two armies. 25,000 soldiers clash on the field. It is an intense and bloody battle. The Continental Army successfully holds off the British into the afternoon. What Washington doesn't know is that his main force has only been engaging half of British General Howe's army. The other half has been sent on a day-long march to the west, around the American defenses, and is now headed for a surprise attack from behind. The battle becomes a rout. Washington is forced to retreat, giving up the fight and giving up Philadelphia. An ocean away in Paris, the loss of Philadelphia is hardly the news Benjamin Franklin needs to bring the French into the war. His old hometown, the new capital, is now in British hands, and the Continental Congress has fled to York, Pennsylvania. But Franklin betrays little concern. He even manages to spin the loss as good news for the Americans, remarking, "Instead of Howe taking Philadelphia, Philadelphia has taken Howe." Franklin predicts to the dubious French that to hold Philadelphia, Howe will be hard-pressed to commit his troops elsewhere. While back in America, George Washington can hardly afford to be so cool. His humiliation emboldens the rivals in his ranks, most notably the head of the northern wing of the Continental Army, General Horatio Gates. Gates is a proud, though somewhat disheveled man. British-born, he left England's rigid military class structure 5 years earlier for a chance to gain glory in America. Gates sees his opportunity. He will make a stand against the British force that is cutting a swath through upper New York in their bid to gain control of the Hudson River, right into the fields of Saratoga. Gates is not the only American officer looking for glory. He has his own rival at Saratoga, in the person of an arrogant and determined general, Benedict Arnold. Over a meal of ox heart, Arnold and Gates talk strategy, and the two couldn't be more different in temperament. Arnold, aggressive and anxious for battlefield glory, wants to attack the British. The more passive and gun-shy Gates wants to wait for the British to come to them.
Horatio Gates couldn't stand Benedict Arnold, considered him an upstart, an arrogant upstart. And Benedict Arnold, like many of the revolutionary soldiers, called Gates Granny Gates, a fussy old woman.
Tempers flare. The conversation turns heated.
And Gates banished his best general from the dinner table, insulted him, wouldn't let him come to meetings. And Benedict Arnold fumed as a result of that dinner and decided that he would have to defy the orders of his commanding officer because he believed the Americans were going to be beaten if it were up to Granny Gates.
October 7th, 1777. Just south of Saratoga, on a rise of land called Bemis Heights, Gates sets 2,400 men out to meet 1,500 British soldiers. A heated battle erupts. On the field, Benedict Arnold, in defiance of Gates' orders, leads an aggressive charge against the Royals.
Arnold employed snipers. He got riflemen, highly accurate, put them up in trees. It was a new kind of warfare, and the British didn't adapt to it.
It is a strategy that gives the Americans the upper hand, but at a high price. Arnold takes a musket ball to his leg and is nearly crushed by his horse.
When the battle was over, his second-in-command said, "Sir, where are you hit?" And Arnold said, "It's my leg. I wish it had been my heart." And I do too. I wish it had been his heart, because if he had died at that moment, he would have been the great hero of the Revolution.
Arnold's battlefield daring has effectively destroyed Britain's northern force, while Gates had directed the battle from the safety of his desk. Yet it is Horatio Gates who takes the credit for the victory. It is not the last slight that Benedict Arnold will have to endure. The British bid for supremacy of the Hudson River ends in surrender. Had General Howe sent reinforcements, the British might have won. But just as Benjamin Franklin predicted, Howe's army was stuck holding Philadelphia. Across the ocean in France, Franklin now has what he needs to bring the French on board. The news of victory at Saratoga is exactly what France's King Louis XVI has needed to hear. He pledges part of his army, and more importantly, his navy, to the American cause in what amounts to a declaration of war between France and England. The American Revolution, which started as a far-off colonial uprising, is now a world war. For Washington, the victory at Saratoga is both good news and bad. He welcomes France's entry into the war, but the anointment of Horatio Gates as the hero of Saratoga again raises questions over who should be in charge of this army. A future as a national hero couldn't have been further from Washington's mind back in 1777. And he had another long winter to face at the much-storied Valley Forge. This was the moment when Washington had to turn around his army and his leadership, or there would never be a United States of America, let alone a President Washington.